in solitary confinement. There was no window. It was all concrete. I had nothing but a small blanket to lay on the concrete floor as a bed. And I did find myself pacing back and forth quite a bit, trying to figure out what to do and how to manage this. And, thankfully, I was never physically harmed, but the facility was not soundproof. And every day I would hear the sounds of inmates in neighboring cells being beaten and tortured. And of course, I couldn't help but wonder when's my turn. I essentially realized that I was in this environment where nothing was off limits.
You are in for a treat today. And by treat, I mean this isn't your typical podcast guest. But I had the pleasure and the treat of listening to today's guest on stage recently at an event. And I can tell you that when he let off his talk, you could literally hear a pin drop in the room. And before I introduce him, I want to throw out a couple of things to make you think for a second. The first things first, which I still find fascinating that I don't think he talks about really enough in his story, is first of all, do you know how many countries there are in this world? I didn't know this statistic before meeting our guest today. And did you know how many people have traveled to all of those countries in the world? Again, something I learned about after listening to him speak. And a part of said travels, he had this little incident. And by little incident, he's going to tell you this story where he was taken hostage in one of the countries and didn't know if he was even going to make it out. And the purpose of today's guest, the purpose of this episode is, as he titles his talks, Winning Through Adversity. And we all know that we've been going through what many would argue the worst time that our industry has seen in the last 30 years, maybe ever. And listening to a story like you're going to hear today puts it all in perspective. And I hope you can take something from it. You will be entertained. So without further ado, Sam Goodman, welcome to the show, man.
Jeff, thanks for having me. Really, really happy to be here, and great that we had the chance to meet in person recently. It was really happy
Absolutely,
for the
man.
opportunity.
Absolutely. So I am going to just pull back and I'm going to let you start telling your story. And if I have anything to add or ask, I will jump in. But I'm looking forward to hearing this all again.
Sure. So, yeah, I appreciate that. So my name's Sam Goodwin. I'm originally from and grew up. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, which we're both kind of in the area today, which is great. I live in DC now, but I'm back just visiting my parents for a few days, which um, is always happy to be back in my hometown. But from 2010 to 2020, kind of giving a quick high level overview here. I mean, kind of dive into some of the details if you're interested. But from 2010 to 2020, during that time, much of which I spent living and working overseas. I was in Singapore for 6 years, in Dubai for a year. I traveled to every country in the world, and like any worthwhile venture or endeavor in life, it wasn't without its challenges. And perhaps most notably, in 2019, I had traveled to 180 of 193 countries in the world, and I went to Syria. And when I arrived, I was taken hostage and accused of being an American spy, accused of espionage, of collaborating with terrorists, and the situation became pretty uncomfortable, and can share more about that if you're interested. But in thank God, thanks to a long list of people who worked tirelessly, I was released. And in the wake of that, as you were kind of talking about perspective, it puts so much into perspective. And I've really been trying to reflect on things that I learned, things that I think can be helpful to others today. It's not so much about kind of the drama or the details of what happened to me, which I can share, but it's where a lot of my time is today is trying to focus on what can be helpful to others. And I don't feel so much survivor's guilt as I feel what I would characterize as survivor's responsibility. I'm really looking for ways to pay that forward. And so today I just recently we met because I was invited to speak at an event, and I'm grateful to say I'm doing quite a bit of that today, being asked to share some of the stories and the messages around it. And so that brought us together, and that's where a lot of my time is today.
I love that. And I want to set the stage a little bit too for those of you that have obviously not seen you speak. And I'm going to guess probably all of our listeners probably haven't. And I will preface this, just I usually will save this for the end, but if you are a real estate broker, a real estate leader, or are part of a group looking for an inspirational speaker, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to implore you to consider Sam. And I preface that because, as I mentioned in kind of your intro, which the room was on pins and needles, or that you could hear a needle drop. I guess it also on pins and needles because we weren't sure what the hell you were doing. And what I mean, what I'm going to describe to you is that, so when I introduced Sam, then we played a video, and then Sam doesn't say anything. He walks up to the stage, and then he quietly paces 4 steps back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I think I had a pretty good hunch of what you were doing, and then you described it. And so I kind of want you to lead with that, as though you're painting that radio picture of what you were doing on stage. And then, yeah, I'd love to hear maybe the Cliff Notes version of what you did at the event, because I do have some questions that we didn't get to ask yesterday, or I didn't get answered. And so let's start there.
Sure. So I was held in captivity for 9 weeks, and the first half of that, the first the first month or so, the first 27 days, I was held in solitary confinement. There was no window. It was all concrete. I had nothing but a small blanket to lay on the concrete floor as a bed, and I did find myself pacing back and forth quite a bit, trying to figure out what to do and how to manage this. And thankfully, I was never physically harmed, but the facility was not soundproof. And every day I would hear the sounds of inmates in neighboring cells being beaten and tortured. And of course, I couldn't help but wonder, when's my turn? I essentially realized that I was in this environment where nothing was off limits. And during that time, I found strength primarily by doing three key things. As you heard recently at this event, I talked primarily on how I found strength, perhaps a bit paradoxically, by leaning into gratitude. Found strength through really focusing on controlling the things that we can control and taking action, and also finally on coming to recognize the uncertainty of the situation as an opportunity, as an opportunity for growth. And I didn't necessarily come to these three things right away, or in the first few days. It took me some time, but what I've realized is that I found a lot of strength in those, and I think by sharing them in a meaningful way can also help others manage their own forms of uncertainty.
Yeah, so I'd love for you to even backtrack a little bit, and because I know what I would think a listener is wondering right now is, how do you even get into this situation? Like, what even caused it? How does this come? Did you get off a plane and they just grabbed? Like, what happened?
Yeah, I was it was May 25th, 2019. I was traveling to country 181 of 193. I was walking through a roundabout on the way to meet up with my guide when all of the sudden a black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. Two armed men jumped out of the back seat and instructed me to get inside. And thankfully, they weren't violent, but I didn't have a choice. I was scared, confused. I had no information or anyone to help. I was desperately trying to understand what was happening. And these men were loyal to the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, and told me that they were skeptical about my travel history and my travel motives. They accused me of espionage, of being an American spy, and collaborating with terrorists, and all of these accusations. And nothing like this had ever happened to me before. And that was essentially kind of how it all started.
So they, yeah, I guess continue. And I guess they spoke English. You didn't mention that yesterday.
Yeah, one of the challenges that I had was the language barrier. There was limited English, but there was just a little bit where they could say a few things. But I was then flown from the northeast region of the country, where I was taken off the street in the cargo hold of a Syrian military plane to what I learned to be Damascus, the Syrian capital city. And I was taken from there, driven to the center of town, taken into the basement of this facility that I now know is called Syria's military intelligence prison number 215, a facility notoriously known for housing political prisoners. And the officer in charge, when I arrived, he spoke a little bit of English, and he escorted me to a cell in the back of the basement. And when he put me in there, I'll never forget, he went to the inside of the cell door and he said, food, water, toilet, knock. Otherwise, quiet, no talking. And he slammed the door and left. And at this point, I was stunned. I was in disbelief about what had happened. In just a few short hours, my life had spiraled out of control in the most terrifying of ways. I felt exactly the way that they wanted me to, just hopeless, utterly cut off from any control of my life.
I want to backtrack for a second. What's it like to fly in the cargo hold? You're sitting in a seat? Do you see? Are you belted in? How does that work?
I was put on a jump seat. I had my hands handcuffed and was just being supervised by an officer. And the uncertainty of the situation became overwhelming. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know what was happening. And sometimes I ask, how often have you ever been flying on an airplane, but not know where the plane is going? That had never happened to me before. And so the uncertainty of the situation was beginning to just grow all around me.
Like, I can't even imagine. What are the emotions that are going through you when you get picked up while you're alone in a country, a foreign country that you're not familiar with, and then put on a plane in the cargo hold to fly. I I can't even imagine what those emotions would be like. Am I gonna? Is the anxiety gonna get so high that I'm just gonna have a heart attack? Am I gonna cry? Like, what are you thinking? What are you feeling?
It's kind of this range of emotions from being taken off the street all the way up to being put in a prison cell. It's like this shock, this confusion, this fear, this terror, and kind of this kind of string of emotions, and was dealing with kind of all of them in different ways at the same time, and balancing all of that. But when I was first, like, early on, I remember, like, did you ever play so I have four younger siblings, two younger brothers, two younger sisters. As a kid, we used to play racing video games like Mario Kart, for
Yeah.
example. And there'd be times where we'd be racing and it would drive off a cliff, right? And I would think to myself, oh, I did, like, reset. We're gonna start this race over again. Like, we're gonna go back. And I remember being put in that cell and thinking, like, I just drove off a cliff. Like, I need to reset. Let me go back a couple hours to this roundabout. Like, I need to start over. And I realized that it wasn't a game. It was real. And so dealing with these, like, old memories, and half the time I was expecting, like, Ashton Kutcher to swing open the cell door and say, you got punked, right? Like, you can't even believe that this is real. I mean, this is a facility that's made for, like, the worst criminals, like terrorists, the worst people in the world. And, like, I was in there somehow being accused of being some kind of threat to their national security. So of course, reflecting back today, just so grateful that things ended peacefully. But all of these different, emotions and thoughts were going through my head.
You mentioned prison, and you said specifically the number 215. Is that how many different facilities or prisons that they have, or is it just a number?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the significance of the number is, but that one is particularly known for all kinds of human rights abuses and so forth.
Not just foreigners, in other words.
Not just foreigners, locals as well. Yeah.
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 Now, you also mentioned the old, food, water, toilet, knock. But you'd mentioned that there was like a hole in your cell that I guess was supposed to work as a toilet. So explain that, or how does that work? I mean, and I'm imagining you're not hungry at the moment, but at some point you got hungry, so you just knock on the cell door and they bring you food, or there was, how?
Yeah, I had to request to go to the bathroom, and I would bang on the door and was usually allowed to. And the bathroom was just, yeah, as you mentioned, as I referenced in my presentation, just this small hole in the concrete floor, a few steps outside the cell door. So that became the bathroom. And then, yeah, the food was essentially just bread and boiled potatoes and water. Occasionally, I got cucumber and a couple tomatoes. I came out of captivity down like about 12 to 15 pounds and just as a result of that very simple, basic, low calorie diet.
How is that? Because and I know you haven't mentioned this yet, but you were in this sort of captivity, so the isolation for roughly 30 days,
For 27 days. Yeah.
27 days. So
Yeah.
you're eating that. What's that like? And how many times a day are you eating it?
I was getting a, I was usually getting like two meals ish a day, and it was essentially just enough to survive and exist. And it was a very kind of simple, basic, low calorie prison diet, but that was all that I had, and that was the all I had access to.
Do you have a distaste or hatred for bread and boiled potatoes now?
Um, thankfully, a lot of that stuff I've kind of worked through, and I feel very kind of healthy mentally and physically today. But yeah, there was a little bit of that when I came home, and just been surrounded by good people, try to work through those things.
I probably should save this question for later, but I'm going to ask it now since we're on the topic. What was the first American meal that you had when you got home?
You know what? So interestingly, I about 3 days after I came home, speaking of food here, I ended up in the emergency room. And I came home and I kind of went crazy with the food. I mean, to answer your question, I think the first thing I ate was a Chipotle burrito. It was like, then like double cheeseburgers and ice cream and all this stuff. And kind of went a little crazy with that. And my stomach became uh, essentially it had adapted to this prison diet and had sort of become unfamiliar with how to process this kind of Western diet. And so I ended up in the emergency room and, thankfully I was able to get sorted out relatively easily. But it does make me wonder about people who are held much longer, sometimes for years, and what their reintegration might look like after a situation like that. So I wish somebody would have just told me, like, hey, just ease into it when you come back, right? And it would have saved me that situation. But um, I'm pretty sure it was a Chipotle burrito.
That's funny. That's
Yeah.
that's that's actually a really good promotion there for Chipotle
Yeah,
right
yeah.
there.
And I'll just quickly mention, so like, these I'm sharing some of these details here. I recently published a book. It's called Saving Sam, and maybe we'll talk about that, but it includes a lot of these details, goes into to detail on some of these things, not only like the drama of things that happen, but what I think we learned and what can be helpful to others today. So if anyone's interested in that, it's called Saving Sam, and it's available everywhere books are sold.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and I was planning on it. So, all right, let's continue forward. So we mentioned that you were in this facility for 27 days. What happened after the 27 days?
I was then taken out of solitary confinement. I was driven across town to the outskirts of the city, taken to another facility called Adra, which is more of like a general population facility. And I was put in a cell with about 40 other men. And I remained here
A
for,
cell. I mean, when I think of a cell, I think of a 10 by 10 room.
yeah, it was bigger than that. It was more of they had like it was kind of like how I've seen like an army barracks. There were bunk beds down both sides with a kind of an aisle in the middle, and there were about 40 of us in there, and we stayed there for another month. And during this time, the other inmates um became friends. We cooked and shared food together. They taught me Arabic. I taught them English. One of them even smuggled this note out of the prison on my behalf. This note that successfully navigated a game of geopolitical telephone and made it to my father in St. Louis and served as the first time I managed to communicate that I was alive. And so these men really risked their life to help save mine and were this remarkable display of humanity. And they reinforced some of the most significant things that I had learned through my travels. I mean, for example, I always say we should never judge people by the actions of their government. I've learned that people who have the least often give the most, something that I found to be true in all corners of the world. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what happened in that second month in more of a general population setting.
Was it almost like an apartment? Did it have a bathroom and a kitchen and things like that?
Apartment is a generous word, but it did have a little bit nicer hole in the floor, I guess. But it was unquestionably an upgrade from solitary confinement, but it had its own challenges from like there's no privacy and you're dealing with all these different personalities and or people. So um, definitely an upgrade, but still working through quite a few things.
So you're now there for 30 days, and as you mentioned, you gained some friendships and relationships, and you taught them English, they taught you their language. Did the majority of them speak English?
Only a few of them did,
Oh,
and
really?
those were the ones that I kind of gravitated to, of course. But really incredible people. And I think one of the sort of challenges that I think I have a little bit with my presentation, my message, is that it's just the way that I portray the country of Syria, because this is a place that's so culturally, historically, religiously significant. It's the cradle of civilization. It's mentioned more than 300 times in the Bible. And in my experience through my travels, some of the best hospitality I've experienced anywhere in the world was across the Middle East. Every country, you name it, and just fantastic hospitality. And so I'm confident that if I wouldn't have had this miscommunication, this situation, I would have had a fantastic experience there as I did everywhere else in the region. So just really incredible people and great hospitality from the people, and that was even the case inside a prison cell.
Was there any arguments, fights, that kind of stuff? And I would feel like that's inevitable.
Yeah, you know what? So I didn't experience any of those. This place where I was at was apparently this huge facility, and I was told that in other parts of the facility there were some things like that that happened while I was there. I didn't experience that where I was at that time.
Interesting. All right. So now you mentioned this note, which you go into greater detail when you speak about it, and the whole laundry thing, and we'll keep that for them to read the book or hire you to come speak. But um, it's a really fascinating story about how you really got incredibly lucky uh, to get out. Can you share how that went down?
Sure. So one of the most overwhelming things for me when I was released was learning about all of the people who were involved on the outside while I was trapped on the inside, none of which I knew anything about at the time. And so the news of my disappearance was essentially learned through me going dark. I was always very good about keeping in touch, especially if I was traveling into more of an unstable place. And I had communicated that I was going to be in Syria for just a few days. And when that time passed and people weren't hearing from me, they began to worry. My father works in civil engineering. My mother is a registered nurse turned educator. Both of them they're smart people and have had relative success in their respective professional fields, but they're an average family from middle America. They had no idea what to do when their son went missing in the Middle East. But thankfully, they began to act and they reached the FBI field office in St. Louis, which pretty quickly escalated some of the highest levels of the US government in Washington. But throughout my captivity, my family had kind of a roller coaster experience with the US government. But early on, And the government communicated two key things to my family. The first, they said, we strongly recommend that you keep this out of the news. Keep all of the communication very tight. Don't let the press get a hold of this because if they do, and Sam's captors, depending on who they are, which was still unknown at the time, feel that type of pressure, they might just kill him. The second thing they said was you should really manage your expectations. We have no diplomatic or economic ties with Damascus. There may not be a whole lot we can do here to help.
Hmm.
So then 3 weeks later, my
Let me
younger
stop you before
sister,
you get to that part of the
yep,
story. And this is all just based on assumptions. We haven't heard from him. He must have been taken hostage.
essentially I just went dark. Yeah, they didn't have anything concrete more than that.
So I can't even imagine what the FBI field office, for example, even like I'm sure they get a lot of false alarm stuff, and they're probably thinking, oh, you know what, your son probably fell in love with somebody and forgot to
Mhm.
message you. You know,
Yeah, my parents tell the story of their first few meetings. It was almost like the FBI interviewing them, trying to figure out who I was and did I get radicalized or fall in love or whatever it was. So there were some, and that's all in the book as well, that dynamic. But you're right about that. Yeah,
wow. Okay, all right,
yeah,
carry forward.
yeah, sure. So about 3 weeks later, my younger sister Stephanie, who was 25 years old at the time, living in Nashville. She particularly became entirely overwhelmed with everything that was happening, and she decided that she needed to call someone and talk to them about this and just blow off some steam, which was against the recommendation of the U.S. government of keeping all of the communication very tight. So she decided that she was going to call her former college roommate who was coincidentally also named Stephanie. So there's this phone call between the Stephanies, and as the story goes, it's say, "How you doing?" And my Steph says, "Well, actually, things aren't very good." And she goes on to explain, "My brother has been missing for weeks. We're working with all of these agencies and officials. Nobody's been able to help. We're really scared." And roommate Steph is, of course, shocked to hear something like this, but she says all the right things, offers her full support. And at the end of the call, as the story goes, roommate Steph says, "Hey, if there's anything I can do, just let me know." And my Steph responds almost jokingly or sarcastically. She says, "Honestly, unless you know someone who knows Assad, the Syrian president, please just pray." And I guess this kind of light bulb went off, and roommate Steph responded and said, "Wait, let me call you back." And it turns out that roommate Steph is Lebanese, and her uncle is good friends with the head of Lebanon's internal security, kind of like the equivalent of the FBI here in the US. And he was able to go to his counterpart in Damascus and mediate my release. And so essentially there was a situation where the FBI, the CIA, the White House, the Pentagon, Pope Francis was involved, Russian intelligence, Middle East NGOs, private sector security companies were all essentially struggling to be effective. But then my sister's college roommate comes along and is able to identify a path to get an American hostage released from captivity in the Middle East. So that's kind of how that happened, and just feel so grateful for everything that took place for the situation to end peacefully.
Is that Stephanie on your Christmas card list now?
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes people ask me, "So did you marry roommate Steph, or how did that play out?" But yeah, very close family friends, and of course, she was my sister's college roommate, so like we kind of knew who she was a little bit. But then now in the wake of this, become very close family friends, and just really incredible people.
That's wild. So finish the story with how that goes down. Somebody just comes to your cell and says, "Hey, you're out." What happens?
Yep. So it was July 26th. 2019, and one of the prison officials came to the cell I was in, and he called my name and he indicated that I was being moved. And as he escorted me outside, he stopped and he said, Sam, you're very lucky. President Assad has agreed to release you. And this sounds encouraging, but I had been lied to so many times in the past 2 months that I had essentially become immune to believing anything like this. But outside, I stepped into this black SUV, which turned out to be part of a 5 vehicle convoy that raced out of Damascus at what seemed to be 100 miles an hour. I mean, we didn't stop at traffic lights. We used the shoulder of the road to maneuver around traffic, and we drove west towards the mountains, and nobody in the vehicle said a word. Like the nice cars, the professional nature of the operation was making me think that this was either like really good or really bad. I mean, I'm about to experience one extreme of the like so-called captivity spectrum here, but I don't know which one it is. And we came up to um, like a checkpoint, one that seemed to be some kind of significant border. And as we passed through, the officer in the vehicle sitting next to me, he tapped me on the leg and he said, Sam, you're in Lebanon. You're safe now. And this was also very encouraging, but I was still putting all the pieces together, and we drove from there for about another hour into Beirut, the capital city of Lebanon, and I was taken to the as I mentioned this office of Lebanon's internal security. And when I walked into the office, I didn't know about anything that had happened with my sister or my family or anything. But when I walked into the office, in addition to dozens of government and military intelligence officials, journalists, my parents were there,
Mm.
and culminating this moment that was just indescribably emotional and one that many people thought would never happen. And it just for me, it was just this breathtaking display of God answering prayers and put so much into perspective.
Two questions about that. The 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 exit. One, who was it? Who was in all of these vehicles? Was it Lebanese or was it Syrians? What was it?
Yep. So the convoy was facilitated by Lebanese special forces. It was General Ibrahim's, who is a friend of my sister's college roommate's uncle. He had sent his special forces to come in and facilitate the actual like movement of me and people out of Damascus.
Why 5 vehicles?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to all of those questions, but I think it was for some sort of security reason.
I guess that's just standard protocol, probably, I imagine.
I think that's at least part of it. Yeah.
And then the same, I guess you probably don't have the answer to the question. Like, why are you running through stoplights? Why are you going on the shoulder? Why?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know why that was necessary or what was all happening, but that was how it went. And I guess they were in a hurry to just get back for some reason,
I
some sort of mission or
My guess is if they stop, you just increase the likelihood that some, for lack of a better term, gang.
something could happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Obviously, they have experience. I mean, that sounds like what you literally watch in movies.
You know, maybe yeah. There's been a little bit of interest in potentially adapting this for something on screen, and with the book out now, provides kind of a blueprint potentially. I don't know if any of that will ever happen, but I am having those discussions, and it's just really about working with people who kind of understand and respect the sensitivity of the situation. It's challenging for myself and my family to like view this through like an entertainment lens because that's not what it was. It was truly life or death. So, if there is an opportunity to, like with the book, an opportunity to share further in a way that we think can help other people or inspire other people, we're open to having those discussions and doing it. And maybe that will come together. But a lot of different variables to consider.
Yeah. Well, and as you mentioned, as you said, it's you use the word, it's your responsibility now, and so that obviously takes us to the next part of the conversation, which I actually, before we get to that, I think it's important for our listener who does this might be the first time they've ever heard of you to understand. Okay, first of all, you can't do this kind of thing if you're probably married, if you have kids. You probably just don't up and go travel to 193 countries from St. Louis, Missouri, which is not exactly a very what I would consider diverse American city necessarily. Um, and yet you did all this. Now I know the backstory. You were in tech, right? And you were working over in Dubai or something like that. Maybe give a little context about all of that before we get onto the meat and potatoes.
Yeah, sure. So there are some people who have traveled every country and are married and have kids. I did this several years ago. This was mostly like in my 20s, and living and working overseas was an advantage to doing something like this. I mean, I was based in Singapore for 6 years. It's the heart of Southeast Asia. I had a little bit of flexibility in my work schedule. Had the world's best airport in my backyard, and I just took advantage of the opportunity to explore as much of the region and beyond as possible on weekends, holidays, time away from work. And so that was where a lot of this started throughout almost my entire travel journey. I was working full time and just doing the best I could with weekends and holidays. So that was how a lot of it started.
Fascinating, man. It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, I travel for a fair amount,
Sure.
maybe 2 or 3 times a month, and I know the strain that it can put on relationships. It's challenging, and so that was one of my first thoughts. I'm like, damn, like that's insane. Also a little jealous, other than the Syrian part, but it's cool. It's well, just that in and of itself is a cool story. I'm one of like 100 people to ever have stepped foot in all 193 countries. In fact, Sam, I bet you know this. If you go out and interview 1,000 people and ask them, do you know how many countries there are in the world? Which I did poll the audience at the event we were at, and not one person knew the answer.
I think I did hear you say that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
wild, man.
Yeah. No, I just feel so like fortunate for the experiences and perspectives and been surrounded by a lot of good people and it's been a great journey and went in a few different ways, a few different directions that I never could have expected, but I just feel really fortunate.
So now you do keynotes, you talk about this stuff, winning through uncertainty. And obviously you do this to a lot of different industries, but surely by now you're very aware and familiar with the economic status of the real estate industry and the struggles that really it's been going through, and the digression really that the industry's had both in real estate and in mortgage, where a lot of people have just fled the industry effectively because they can't survive. And so it's arguably a very depressing place for a lot of professionals. And so, how do you use your story, your experience to advise and guide people in the business world?
So my presentations are narrative driven and include all the dramatic elements of my stories, but also weave in and conclude with key principles that I think we can all implement into our own lives. My primary theme is uncertainty, as you mentioned, and essentially I was pushed to a point of overwhelming uncertainty, truly life or death. But through that, I learned some things that have helped me, and some things that I think can help all of us in our personal, professional, and spiritual lives when we're facing our own forms of uncertainty, whether that's in real estate or finance or insurance or healthcare, whatever it may be. And so I try to make that relevant to all of us in a range of different ways, primarily through those three key takeaways. I talk about leaning into gratitude, talking about focusing on taking action and controlling the things that we can control, and then focus on recognizing our uncertain times as an opportunity for growth and try to pull from my experience to help make that relevant to others today. And I don't want to be known for the way I don't want to be known for the things that happen to me. I want to be known for the way I've responded to them. And I hope that my presentation, even reading my book, can empower others to take a similar approach.
Yeah, and I think that's the way we all have to look at life in any challenging circumstances, which is how do I come out of this?
Yeah, and the opportunities that are available. How do we come out, not only come out of it, but come out of it stronger?
Yeah. Yeah. And the truth is, there are many professionals still having successful years, still not just surviving, but thriving, and some having their best years. It's just not like it was. In fact, I had some conversations at that event with some of the guys that were there, guys and gals, and who said, I got into the business in 2019 or 2020. And you may or may not know this, but 2020 and 2021 were like you literally just had to have a pulse to be able to have success in the industry. And for some people, success levels that almost unheard of. They'll never probably face or feel again. But to many, it was like, wow, this is what this is. Holy crap, this is easy. And then now, over the last probably 2 to 3 years, it's literally flipped upside down, and it's survival for many. And so, um, what would be that piece of advice if let's just say Stephanie is a real estate agent now, and she's like, damn, brother, like, or the other Stephanie, and just like, uh, I'm sitting here feeling sorry for myself, and then I think about you, and I'm like, what the hell's wrong with me? And so, what would be your advice to somebody who's in that place?
Sure, I would just say I think we're all stronger and more resilient than we can imagine, and in uncertain times are exactly what we need in order to grow.
Simple and concise. I like that. I like that. So, uh, before I ask you some off the wall random questions, anything else to share about that whole story, and anything to share with this audience?
No, I appreciated the opportunity to share it here, and it's kind of the overview. As I mentioned, there's more information in the book if anyone's interested in that. But that's yeah, kind of in a nutshell. Really a pleasure to share some of that today with you.
I love it. Yeah, Saving Sam, which I will be definitely getting my hands on that book and probably even use it as a gift because I think it's such a cool story.
Appreciate
Um,
it.
I'd love to ask you just some kind of off the wall questions, just
Yeah, sure.
knowing, kind of knowing your background. The first two questions are, what is your favorite country to visit? Like the one country, if I said you can never go to any other country for the rest of your life outside of America, obviously you live in America, outside, not including America, what is
Mhm.
the one place that you would absolutely unequivocally go back to?
After the US, I would say New Zealand. I think it's the most naturally beautiful place in the world, and it's worth every second of travel required to get to its corner of the world.
Yeah, and no doubt it is on the other side of the earth, literally.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, on the opposite end of the spectrum, what would be the last place you would ever go back to? I think most assumptions would be Syria.
Yeah, I don't know that it would be Syria actually. Yeah, I have kind of a complicated relationship with Syria, but I would actually appreciate the opportunity to go back there sometime. I would probably say, some landlocked country in Africa like Chad. Probably don't have much interest in going back there. I enjoyed my time. I just, unless there was a reason, I probably wouldn't seek it out.
It wasn't that great. You did mention that you felt most unease in an African country. Was that Somalia, you said?
Yeah, in Somalia, Mogadishu was probably the place in the world where I did feel, yeah, as you mentioned, probably just the most uncomfortable. Somalia is the only country in the world that doesn't have a central form of government, so there's quite a bit of opportunities to improve things there. Still, though, incredible people and food and all that. Just um, felt uncomfortable with some of the dynamics there.
What would you say is the wildest thing, craziest thing you've seen?
Craziest thing I've seen. Um, Gosh, I'd have to think about that. I mean, in Cambodia, I ate a tarantula, which was somewhat crazy and memorable. So that's something that comes to mind.
What it tastes like?
It actually was fried, so it tastes kind of like a potato chip. Well, the legs were like potato chips, but then the body was again, it was it tasted kind of like chicken actually. So it wasn't. But the thing that got me was the fur. That was what
Ooh,
the
yeah,
that was
interesting.
the yeah, that made it interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, I imagine you've tried all kinds of off the wall. I'm
Range of things,
thinking like of
especially in
Indiana
Asia.
Jones. I'm like thinking Indiana Jones when they bring the monkey head out or something like that.
Right, like in Asia, I think I had some like chicken hearts and pig intestines and things like that. So they eat all kinds of things there. Yeah.
Wild. Last question. What's next for Sam? What does the future look like?
Yeah, thanks. I came home from this and I went back to school. So I did my master's at Wash U and trying to learn more about the world, international affairs, and then actually went from there in 2022 to 2024. I moved on from there and actually continued to learn. I did my doctorate at Johns Hopkins, also international affairs, and so just been trying to learn. In the meantime, I've been really humbled to say I've been asked and invited to share this story and the messages around it. So that's where a lot of my the time and energy is today with trying to use this to have some kind of good and appreciate the opportunity today to talk to you and hopefully I think it plays a little bit of a part in that, so I appreciate it, and that's where a lot of my time is today.
So that is your job, speaking.
I speak full time. Yeah, never could have expected where life was going to go, but I really enjoy it.
How often do you speak per year?
I do right now. I do about 60 events a year.
Not bad. All over the world.
Um, yeah, mostly North America, mostly US and Canada. But yeah, occasionally I did recently was in Argentina, done some stuff, I was in Mexico recently. So, but mostly, the US and Canada.
That's actually important to point out too, by the way, is that if anybody was really actually paying close attention, you remember that Syria was 180.
Mhm.
And so you had 12 or 13 more countries to go to that you had to go after you went through this ordeal. That's kind of
Yeah.
nuts.
Yeah, yeah, I kind of some conversation with my family, putting things into context and perspective but yeah, the I did finish it after this experience.
And ironically, the last country was one of the biggest.
There was Brazil. Yeah, and wanted a
Wild.
place where I could bring some kind of family and friends and we had a good time there. It was actually New Year's Eve and it was on Copacabana Beach. There was like literally 3 million people on the beach. It was a pretty big gathering, pretty big party.
Yeah, a gathering
Yeah.
is an
Yeah.
understatement, I imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Sam, this has been an absolute pleasure. I could probably continue to ask you questions, but I want to be mindful of your time. Again, I'm going to mention it, Saving Sam, and basically you just probably go into Google, type it in, and um, it'll come right up. Does it say, is it your name as the author on there? Is that at the bottom there? I'm looking at an image.
Yep, yep. I'm the author. It's available on Amazon or everywhere books are sold, Barnes and Noble, etc. So you can find it. It's called Saving Sam.
And if somebody wanted to connect with you and maybe talk about booking you as to speak at an event, how would they do that?
Yeah, please, of course, for any reason, feel free to reach out. I'm on all the normal social media channels. Jeff has my contact info. Please reach out anytime. I'd be happy to hear from you and would be great to connect.
Easy to find you on socials just as Sam Goodwin.
Yep, that's right.
Awesome. Sam, what a pleasure, man. Just fun. It's fun. What a great story. You're clearly an inspiration, and look forward to kind of watching your journey and seeing what you do.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the chance to be here.